Thanks again to the Tech Capital for having us to another fantastic event. So, what's happened in Malaysia over the last 4 years has been nothing short of remarkable. All the major US, Chinese hyperscale cloud companies have opened cloud regions there, and effectively every key regional operator has announced or is under construction. So, a very interesting stat I saw the other day, pre-2021, the main operators in the market were the likes of AIMS, VADS, NTT, Basis Bay, OpenDC, and Bridge had just entered the market. Fast forward 3 or 4 years, you effectively have the incumbent Malaysian companies alongside the monster regional players, PDGs, the AirTrunks, the STTs of the world, not to mention all the hyperscale US cloud under construction or at least acquired land in certain parts of Malaysia. So there's a lot happening in this market, driven by a number of factors. We've got a very good panel with us today to shed some light on this for us. So there'll be time for questions at the end, but without further ado, Lionel Yeo, CEO of STT for Southeast Asia. Lionel played a pivotal role in the Malaysian market entry for STT alongside other key Southeast Asian markets. So STT, as everyone knows, backed by Temasek, one of the biggest DC players globally, and presence in almost every key Southeast Asian and North Asian markets in APAC. Andy Sutrisno, TMT sector coverage lead for Sumitomo Mitsui, going to provide some interesting insights on the financing landscape across the region, which can't be ignored. Been working closely alongside the likes of PDG and others, financing developments and standing assets across the region. James Ricks, Head of Data Centers and Industrial Project and Delivery Services for Malaysia at JLL. He's helped deliver over data centers in over 14 global markets and full-time based in KL. And finally, Weng Yew Wong, Founder and Group Managing Director of OpenDC, 5 data centers across Malaysia at the moment, and exciting plans ahead, been in the market since 2017, if I'm right. So Lionel, on to you. STT entered the Malaysia market almost exactly a year ago. What were ultimately the driving factors behind STT's market entry, noting that, you know, in your other Southeast Asian market entries, you're often the first in, the likes of Thailand and Manila. What was the driving factor behind your market entry in November last year?
Thanks, Fred, and again, happy to see a lot of familiar faces around here. You know, if I were to answer this question, it's really just down to demand. We're seeing a great deal of demand coming into Malaysia, which Fred had just mentioned earlier, and I can sort of characterize it in, you know, based on a few factors. I think the first and foremost would be the Singapore moratorium. As a lot of you are aware, you know, Singapore, Japan, Hong Kong used to be the regional hubs serving all the data centers within the region itself, and all the space within these key regional hubs are constrained. With the Singapore moratorium, that has sort of facilitated, you know, other countries or even hyperscalers to look outside of Singapore. So that's the first factor coming in. You know, and the second factor would be the strong push from the Malaysian government, you know, coming in the form of incentives, grants, as well as facilitation of foreign investments into the country. Fred spoke about, you know, the investments from all the hyperscalers. We're seeing billions of dollars, you know, from Amazon, Microsoft, Oracle, you know, all public, all bringing in investments in billions into Malaysia. And that's not only the Western hyperscalers, we have seen the same from the Chinese hyperscalers, which really, you know, sort of drove the demand into Malaysia and especially in Johor. And the last wave, of course, is also helped by the whole AI wave, which really picked up, you know, just 2 years ago. We saw you know, it all started with ChatGPT popularizing it, but the whole strong wave of AI creating another subset of demand of cloud, and then a lot of it, you know, had to find a space to land. And Malaysia saw a lot of, you know, benefited a lot from these 3 trends. So really, you know, it's a very strong demand that we've seen coming to Malaysia, which really prompted STT GDC alongside many of the other providers to enter into Malaysia.
Thanks, Lionel. And how does Malaysia compare on a regional basis in terms of ease of entry into the market from a data center operator's perspective?
Yeah, I would say that, again, back to the Malaysian government and how they've really done well in facilitating foreign direct investments. In the past, Southeast Asia used to be taught as a region fraught with, difficulties, red tapes, bureaucracies. It's hard to understand the culture, but, I think what the Malaysian government has done well is they have attracted the big tech into Malaysia. I just give one example. They have the agencies, called MIDA, and they actually have account managers that actually facilitate all the foreign investment companies wanting to come into the country and laying out the red carpet for these guys. This is a conversation that I have with a lot of my other countries, and in fact, telling some of the other countries to sort of learn from this example, because it really helps to drive the understanding into the country and break through all these perceived barriers. I think the other thing that is going for Malaysia is, of course, its low power costs, which really helps in terms of attracting the new wave of customers in the AI side, where large scale data center campuses are required.
Thank you. And obviously you entered the market alongside Basis Bay as your local joint venture partner. What benefits does that bring in terms of speeding up the entry and the scalability in that market?
I mean, if I were to take a step back, if we look at STT GDC today, we serve about more than 1,000 companies, but having said that, 80% of our revenue is generated by hyperscalers, which we continue to focus on. But there is a good 20%, of this crowd, which speaks to more than 1,000 logos, that still require us to service them. Now, when we look at the enterprise segment, that's where Basis Bay come in. Entering into market like KL, we are still looking at the two-pronged strategy. Obviously the hyperscalers, it's our core bread and butter, and that's where we continue to chase both Western and Chinese. But on the enterprise side, where they need a little bit more delicate care, more managed services, a larger suite of services, that's where Basis Bay come in. They are a 25-year-old Malaysian company with a strong portfolio of customers within their data center today, and they will partner us to serve this segment, alongside with STT GDC.
Brilliant. And James, obviously you being on the ground in KL, we've heard of the immense positivity in terms of how easy it is to enter the market. Actually on the ground, are things getting harder now?
I think that's very interesting, Fred. Just want to wind back a little bit. When I spoke at the first data center conference in Jakarta back in 2009, in Indonesia there was less than 1 megawatt of IT power draw. In Johor Baru in 2009, there was 0 kilowatts of power draw. When I left Asia in 2015, in Johor Baru, 1 megawatt maybe, or the aspirations for. Today, there's been an immense growth. Having just returned back to Asia, I continue to be surprised. But are there challenges? Yes, there most certainly are. First of all, there are regulatory challenges. I mean, just recently, this week, the Straits Times reported that 30% of data center applications in Johor Baru have been refused. It's interesting because of the reasons why. But what data centers have to do now is they have to go to the Data Center Development Coordination Committee to get approval first before they get a development order. Prior to June of this year, you could just go out, get a development order, start building. Not matter. But now there is more regulation coming in, along with the talent to actually build it. We are seeing people jump ship for 1,000 ringgits a month. Because they get 1,000 ringgits over the fence, that's where they'll go. So it becomes much more challenging to actually resource and staff up data center projects. That's Johor Baru. Is it any different in Selangor? No. Is it any different in Cyberjaya? No. Is it any different in Bukit Jalil? No. Any other area will have exactly the same challenges. We can sit here and wring our hands and say, oh, how terrible it is, but it's down to us, everybody in this room, to do something about it in the markets that you operate in. Whether it is in Indonesia, in Jakarta, in Batam, in Johor, in KL, wherever you operate, it's down to you to do something about it. And when it comes to talent, there's no data center talent. There's lots of talent that has critical environmental and engineering experience. Look at people that are demobbing from the armed forces. They're used to working in a critical environment. They're used to maintaining critical environment equipment. Why are we not attracting them to work within the data center industry? It's working well in other geographies. It will also work well here. We need to not have a closed mind or a very narrow focus, but a wide focus on what the challenges actually are, and look at a wide focus to be able to resolve those challenges.
Thanks, James. Let's focus in on Johor for a minute. Clearly the story here has been incredible. Even 3 years ago, you're looking at 20 megawatts of capacity, and now latest figures are about 3.3 gigawatts of live under construction and phased capacity. So, it's interesting when you look at the fact that question marks do still remain in a market like Johor, despite the announcements. Power, connectivity, co-location pricing, diversity of customers. Weng, if we pass over to you, given your focus on interconnectivity and the retail side of things, that's much less documented in the mainstream media. In JB itself, what are you seeing from a demand perspective for open DC services, and where is that demand actually coming from?
Well, back in the 2017, when we first started in Johor Baru, we literally have to beg people to come into Johor Baru during those days. I remember those days when we visited some of the customers in Singapore. It's always a case, this is not suitable for them to put a DR site. But today it's very different, because what we are seeing today, a lot of customers, in additional to the hyperscale, who already have moved in. We have seen CDN players, content players. They're using Johor Baru as an extension to Singapore. So typically, it goes in 3 phases. Phase 1, they use Johor Baru as an extension. Phase 2, they start to migrate some of the connectivity. In phase 1, most of the traffic still go back to Singapore. But in phase 2, some of the traffic start to find its way to be dissipated in Malaysia. And then phase 3, then they start to migrate everything in Singapore over to Johor. So we are seeing consistent practices among the, I think primarily Chinese players, which are more cost sensitive. And then lately we have also seen enterprises also doing the same when they start to migrate the DR site over to Johor. And then I will not be surprised to see that ultimately they will make Johor Baru one of their main hub too. So all this actually, I would say we are looking at only at the beginning of what is going to be a massive scale up in the capacity in Johor Baru. There's no doubt that pricing will play a role because Singapore, the pricing is still relatively high compared to Johor Baru, so the cost is still a driver at this stage. But ultimately, I believe Johor itself will grow its own ecosystems, and it will be more of an ecosystem play compared to Singapore. So the way we project going forward is likely to be like a twin city scenario. There's an ecosystem in Singapore, and then Johor will develop its own ecosystems, and then they will be complementing one another going forward.
because we've seen the likes of Equinix enter Johor already on that interconnection side. Do you think others will follow?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think what we are developing alongside with our data center is our internet exchange platform. So the internet exchange platform, we also see a tremendous amount of traffic growth. We have, over the past 1 year, we've seen about 300% growth in our traffic. So I think all these are the testaments to how solid is the migrations.
Thank you. Thank you. And Andy, we haven't been ignoring you. The financing side of the market in JB, again, 3.3 gigawatts of capacity requires a hell of a lot of bank financing. How hard is that environment at the moment? Are the banks comfortable, or are different avenues of finance being sought?
I would say like the interesting part of how Malaysia has developed in terms of financing needs. I think when I first started doing data center financing, it's all Singapore, right? It's pretty straightforward. You have Singapore, you know the market, and it's pretty predictable. Lease rates are pretty stable. And then it started moving out to Indonesia, right? And then we see all these, massive developments in Kerawang and Cikarang and a lot of these areas near Jakarta. And then suddenly, we have this massive influx in Johor. Frankly speaking, the first wave, we did not participate much. And just simply because it was really a big question mark for us as an institution at that point. Pretty much single off-taker, taking up the whole capacity, massive development, big question mark on the availability of infrastructure, the readiness, and et cetera, et cetera. And then not even a year after, right, and we started seeing even more growth in the market. And I think what we have seen as a financial institution here is that how the financing has rapidly evolved from a straightforward, typical non-recourse project financing or corporate level financing, if it's a Malaysian group or maybe like, some other groups that are opening up like STT GDC into Malaysia, into quickly becoming a platform level simply because of the massive capacity that is being deployed in Malaysia. I mean, actually just before coming down, I looked very briefly on the latest database. Out of like 10 over gigawatts visible for Southeast Asia, almost half of it will be in KL and JB only, right? And that really speaks volume on what we are really seeing in Malaysia. And is that a problem for financial institution? I wouldn't say it's a problem. Obviously, we're happy that we can deploy our balance sheets. But on the other hand, yes, it is, because it is a massive liquidity transfer into a single market. And obviously, it's a little bit concerning, and especially with the concentration on very few off-takers so far. It's changing. It's slowly changing. We're seeing a lot of new names coming in. But yeah, it's a challenge. And the structure as well, it reminds us of how Indonesia was the hotbed for tower financing back in the days, right? How it started all this tower financing structure, how it actually evolved into a more commonly accepted standard in this region. And we are seeing that for data center financing in Malaysia for this region.
And are you seeing diversity of exit avenues for the investors ultimately in the Johor market with the scale that's being discussed?
Honestly, I think it's not a possibility. I think it's a requirement after a point, because obviously, as financial institutions, we do need to recycle our capital as well, right? This heavy amount of concentration would be pretty heavy for a lot of the lenders, and I think even locally, you can already see a little bit of strain to liquidity. So I think we are obviously hoping that there are other avenues of liquidity as well, in order for banks to be able to recycle capital and continue supporting our clients, and not in a single market only, right? I mean, because most of our clients are regional players, and we obviously try to always support them expand regionally. And it's just a single concentration right now in Malaysia is draining a lot of this liquidity. And obviously, it's ideal if we can have other methods to recycle the capital as well.
No, it's very interesting because, like we heard from Morgan earlier, playing in the tier 1 markets from an investor and a financing side is much different to the tier 2s, but the quantum being discussed in Johor can't be ignored from investors or financiers alike. So moving on to James and Weng, we heard earlier about 30% of the planning consents are being declined as of late. Do you think those concerns are going to actually increase from both a government level and ultimately a public support level as well? Malaysia's been the darling of the data center tier 2 environment at the moment with all the growth across KL and Johor, but we've seen in other markets, whether it's Singapore or Korea, that things can change very quickly, and the minute the population starts to say, actually, we don't want this power consumption and we don't want this development and the job creations aren't enough. Do you think we're at a tipping point at this moment?
I don't think we're at that tipping point right at this moment, but the data center industry has always been very reactive. When something happens externally, then the data center industry will do something. But we have the opportunity now to be proactive as part of this. So we need to be engaging with the local community. How can we, as data center owner-operators, providers, consultants, engage with that community? Well, the community needs to see what they're going to get out of having a data center. And it doesn't just matter whether it's in Malaysia, but also anywhere else, in Jakarta, in Batam. What are they going to get out of having a data center near them? Data centers are relatively poor employers. A large facility, maybe 200 people at most. So what does that give the local community? Well, not very much. But what we need to look at is a little wider than this very narrow lens. If we look at the wider ecosystem that supports a data center, empirical evidence shows that there will be between 4 and 5 jobs created for every 1 data center job. So that means those 200 people working on that data center, there could be up to 1,000 jobs created within the ecosystem. We need to make sure that that ecosystem is local to that data center. Interestingly, why 30% of those applications in Johor Baru have been refused has been on sustainability grounds. So what is the data center doing to improve sustainability? What about the cleanliness of the rivers that surround the data centers? Are they looking at how they can clean up those rivers? I was quite interested when I came back to Jakarta after a break of nearly 10 years that some of the rivers here were so much cleaner. Rather than being seas of rubbish within them, there's been a clean-up program, not by data centers, but by the community. Can we invest the same amount of emphasis with data centers and community within Malaysia? Yes, we can. Is the will there? Well, hello, wake up, data center owner-operators. You need to be engaging the community, otherwise you will see protests against data centers as you see at data center conferences in places like Ireland and America. Do you want to see that in Malaysia? Do you want to see that in Indonesia? No. So engage with the community. Show what training is available. People like, I'm involved with a Nomad Futurist Foundation, provide free training for underprivileged communities to be able to join the data center industry, to demystify that industry. Give us an opportunity and we can really do some real great work. And if you want to know more about Nomad Futurist, come and talk to me afterwards or find out Daryl Dunbar, who's in the audience. We can talk to you about what is possible to do, what the art of the possible actually is.
Whether I see any tightening on the data center bill approval, yes, it is indeed happening. But is that a showstopper? I don't think so, because what we are building in Johor today is essentially Singapore 2.0. The massive amount of capacity built up, the number of players coming over. We are essentially creating a very important ecosystem for the whole regions. And Does that mean that people should just continue to pour into Johor? Maybe not, but there are definitely better investments in other part of Malaysia. So I think what it means is for the industry to continue to build on these ecosystems, they should be looking out for other areas that can similarly tap into these ecosystems, but without all the stringent regulations. So there are those opportunities available in Malaysia.
Thank you, Weng. And Lionel, just over to you. We've seen the Singapore government release an initial 80 megawatts of capacity. Land announcements and transactions were announced this week on behalf of Equinix. There was then another announcement 6-7 months later announcing another 300 megawatts of capacity. Is this going to make any difference to the demand in JB, or ultimately it's not going to have any effect at all?
Yeah, I think there's going to be minimal impact to the development in Johor. I think Weng and James mentioned about the whole ecosystem, and I think the beauty of data centers is demand is very sticky. You don't just close shop and pack up one day, because it's just going to be very costly. So the boat has sort of sailed in a path that it can be easily reversed. But if we just take a step back and talk about the numbers itself, 300 megawatts, and how the size of it in comparison with the demand that we're looking today. I mean, if you look at global co-location demand, we're looking at around 4.7 gigawatt per year, right? And if you sort of slice and dice, let's say you take a third for APAC, that would be around 1.5, and a third of it, say, going to Southeast Asia, that's a 500 megawatt demand and growing every year. Now, if you think about the moratorium and what he has done is he has curtailed demand for 2 years. So really, there's a lot of catch-up builds that are happening within Asia to keep up with this demand. Is 300 megawatt going to be enough to cater to all of this demand? The answer is no, right? Because the demand itself is requiring a lot more. And that's really excluding even the AI side, which has really gone crazy over the last year or so. So I think from a demand perspective, we're still seeing very positive signs of demand. What's really going to happen is, providers are going to be a bit more selective. End users are going to be more selective in the workloads that they're going to house in Singapore, because it's very expensive, right? I mean, power cost is close to two times that of Malaysia, and we'll never be able to compete on that front. But again, there is still, it is still a strong connectivity hub. There is still a lot of preference for specific workloads to be housed in Singapore. So that's going to be there's going to be a bit of selection process of what needs to be housed in Singapore and what's going to go to JB.
Thanks, Lionel. Currently sat in Jakarta. A couple of years ago, Johor and Batam were in the same sentence. Fast forward to today, Johor has clearly surged ahead in terms of deployment of capacity. Andy, over to you. Do you think sort of recent developments in the JB market will mean that actually we'll start to see Batam come back to the fore?
I think, okay, first of all, I think that just now the way Wong actually mentioned twin cities or twin centers for data center hub in Southeast Asia between Singapore and JB, it's sort of like a good illustration of what I do believe personally would happen, is that because some of the workloads will be split between Singapore as the central processing and networking hub versus other markets, in this case, Johor. So the question is, does Indonesia, especially Batam, have the potential to do so? Yeah, sure. It has direct connection to Singapore. In terms of location, it's not that far different to Johor geographically. Obviously, there is the matter of being connected through land versus through sea, but is a potential there. And obviously, we have been discussing with a lot of our clients in terms of developments in Batam as well as Bintan, right? And for that matters. But I feel that some of my discussions with some of the clients, the reason why Johor has become Johor of what it is now, because Indonesia has maybe roughly, in terms of visibility of IT capacity, is about 1 gigawatt. somewhere around there, and you can see like that's a big difference with where Johor plus KL now. So I guess yes, there's a potential, but I think there is a path that needs to be considered and followed. Not so much followed, but there needs to be considered of what Johor has successfully managed to achieve. And the good thing is there's already like case in point that we can not so much replicate, but at least learn from, in order for Batam to be able to catch up. Because I think there is a need for that.
100%. 100%. And Weng, finally, just want to touch a bit more on what you said earlier in terms of, OpenDC are basically breaking away from the standard Malaysian data center locations of KL, Cyberjaya, and ultimately JB. Recent announcement in Delapan. Can you walk us through the thought process there, the customer profile that you'll be targeting, and when you reckon you'll be operational there?
Sure. First of all, let me share where Delapan is. It's actually the border city between Malaysia and Thailand. So when you look at peninsular Malaysia, at the southern tip you have Singapore. At the northern side, that's Thailand. So the way Thailand connect to Malaysia, that's a city at the border known as Bukit Kayu Hitam. Delapan is actually one of the zone at the border between Bukit Kayu Hitam and the Danau. So this location has been earmarked by the Ministry of Finance to be developed as a special border economic zone. So the goal is to try to replicate the success of Johor Baru to the north. Now, why this area for us to build a data center? I think when we analyze the location, one thing that we find very unique about this location is that around 100 km radius away from these locations, there are actually 4 submarine cable landing stations with 16 submarine cable coming that terminates onto the 4 cable landing stations. And there isn't one data centers anywhere near that area. So most of the traffic exchange between the submarine cable, they either have to go back to Bangkok or they have to go to KL or even further to Singapore to be exchanged. So we picked that locations to build our data centers. At the same time, we have also announced we will be building an internet exchange where we had a partnership with DKIX. So we are building an ecosystems where we can help all the connectivity players to meet at one locations and to exchange traffic there. So this is how the thought process come about. Now, along the way, of course, there have also been discovery that the northern part of Malaysia happens to have much longer sunlight every day. We have about 5 to 5.5 hours sunlight. So it's ideal to be a solar generations zone as well. So I think if we add all up together, these are very exciting locations for us to build a data centers with the complement of a renewable energy supply. Now, the last but not least, that locations happens to also facing out to the west, which is the Indian Oceans, where there are a lot of submarine cable from Middle East, Europe, Middle East, India, coming into the Southeast Asia. And all these cable pass through Malacca Strait, where a lot of people, it's well known that Malacca Strait is very narrow. There's a very high concentration of submarine cable there. Anything happens to that locations, there will be a catastrophic impact to our internet infrastructures. So what we are offering for the submarine cable players is to terminate their cable into our Delapan data center and then taking a terrestrial route going down to Singapore. as a backup to the Malacca Strait. So we built all these things together as a platform to offer to not only the OTT players, but also the submarine cable operators too. So we believe that is actually one of the very interesting locations, and it can, it has the potential to change the dynamics of the internet landscape in the regions. Yeah.
Thank you, Weng. And thanks to our panelists. That's probably all for now. So if anyone has any questions, please fire away.
Thank you, Fred. My name is Eric Hadi from Nusantara Data Center Academy. I have one question addressed to Mr. Wong and also Mr. Andy Sutrisno. The question is, from your perspective, how do you see Indonesia as a country? Is the country able to compete with Malaysia in these regards? I know you mentioned about connectivity, but what should the country do if it wants to compete with Malaysia? Thank you.
I'll probably take the safe route here and respond based on commercial. Look, the simple fact is Indonesia is such a huge market, right? I think it makes a lot of sense for data centers to be located onshore in Indonesia, right? Just simply due to the lag and the processing that is required in the country itself, it makes a lot of sense. Now, can Indonesia compete with Malaysia? I think that's a very interesting question. I mean, I see no reason why they cannot, right? I mean, there is a huge market demand here. There is a use case for Indonesia to have the data centers, and not to mention data sovereignty is always a question mark, right? And it's just a matter of timing, and it's always a concern for a lot of the regulators globally. So obviously, yes, there is that potential. I think it's just more like I say, it's a case and study on how Johor managed to streamline a lot of the processes and make sure that the operators have ease of access to start a business and permits and licenses. One of the deals I did in Indonesia is a nationwide network, and the process of novating the license itself took years to finish, right? And that speaks volume on the complexity of the regulation in this place, and that unfortunately has hindered the rapid development that is potentially possible for deployment in the country, I feel.
My answer to that is slightly different. So I think if anything, we look at the competition between Singapore and Malaysia, that can be a mirror image to what will happen eventually between Malaysia and Indonesia. So if you look at Singapore, the challenge we have in Singapore is a resource. Malaysia, we definitely have much more. But if Malaysia were to compare to Indonesia's, there's no way Malaysia have sufficient resources to compete with Indonesia. So it's just a matter of time, if you ask me. Indonesia will be able to catch up, because given the sheer market size, the amount of resources that it has at its disposal, if they were to tweak the regulations a little bit, I do not see why Indonesia cannot do better than Malaysia. I mean, that's my thought. Yeah.
Can I just join in with that question? Why do you want to compete? I mean, you have a country here, 260 million people? I mean, if you have edge data center facilities across the archipelago, linked back to processing regional data centers, you're creating a much more vibrant economy. And people then want to join into that economy because they have reach across the whole archipelago. So why do you want to compete with Malaysia? Look at your own market, which is a fantastic market. Do you know an Indonesian that owns one handphone? There are probably very few. They normally have 2 or 3 handphones. all of which are running through data centers somewhere. You have a great captive market that you can use if you think outside of the box. Don't think compete with Malaysia, compete with Indonesia, or compete with Singapore. Look at the internal market, and you will have a very vibrant economy. And if you use things like edge data centers to bring compute closer to your end user, there you may have a much better use case than thinking, oh, I need to compete with Malaysia.
Yeah, I mean, I can just add on more from an operator standpoint, and I think Indonesia is a big market for us at STTGDC as well. I agree with James. I think there's no need for competition because the market is big enough. I mean, if you look at I think the focus really should be on government policies as well as facilitating foreign investments. I think that is, if there's anything that could be better supported. I mean, if Indonesia can make Batam work, Jakarta will be an easy sell for a lot of investments. And I think if you compare the attributes of Indonesia versus Malaysia, I mean, power cost is not too far apart. So really, it just comes down to the finer details and being opportunistic. Right? I think the next wave is AI, and I guess the big question is what will be the government's policies, and as well as what are they working towards capturing that demand. So again, I think a lot of it comes down to government, because that will change perception, and that also that changes the way people think about investments into the country.